It's not every day you see something like this happen. A royal and a politician sitting across from each other, not to argue, not to posture, but to actually talk about something real, something human. This wasn't about policies or power plays or who gets the last word. This was about faith, morality, and what it means to be a decent human being in a world that's forgotten decency. Here were two men from entirely different worlds, suddenly finding common ground in the conversation about Islam. Not the Islam people read about in the headlines, not the one filtered through fear or politics, but the Islam of values, compassion, and structure. And what struck me was the tone, honest, unguarded, almost searching. The royal spoke with calm reflection, the politician with urgency, both realizing that beyond the noise of media and division, there's a deep hunger for moral direction. They weren't debating religion. They were wrestling with the soul of civilization itself. And in that moment, you could almost feel it, the walls of stereotype, of misunderstanding starting to crack just a little under the weight of genuine human curiosity. You know what's fascinating about this conversation? It wasn't about politics or ideology. It was about the future, about where humanity is headed. And what both of them said, what they felt, was that Islam, with its values of discipline, community, and moral clarity, might just hold the keys to what Europe's been searching for but can't seem to find. Look around. We've got wealth, technology, endless entertainment, but no sense of purpose. People are lonely, families are falling apart, and morality's become something you only talk about when it's convenient. Yet here comes this perspective, this faith that says life has meaning, community matters, self-control isn't weakness, it's strength. They weren't saying Europe will convert, they were saying Europe might learn. Because Islam, at its core, offers something Western society has lost. The idea that there's more to life than profit, more to freedom than doing whatever you want. And when they said it, it wasn't a warning. It was almost hopeful that maybe, just maybe, as Europe faces these crises of the soul, it'll start to see in Islam not an enemy, but a mirror reflecting what it once believed in. Let me tell you something. We are living in a time where people have more than they've ever had before, and yet they feel emptier than ever. You walk through the streets of London, Paris, Berlin, cities that once defined philosophy, art, revolution, and you see people scrolling through their phones, buying things they don't need, chasing something they can't even name. That's the crisis. The European identity, once built on community, integrity, and shared belief, has turned into this fragile construct held together by consumerism and convenience. People have food, freedom, technology, but they've lost connection, family, purpose. And when you compare that to Islam, you see something deeply different. You see people anchored by faith, by discipline, by this collective sense that life isn't just about what you own, but what you owe to your creator, to your family, to your society. It's not about wealth, it's about worth. And what's ironic, almost tragic, is that while the West looks at Islam through suspicion, it's the very thing that holds the antidote to the disease it's suffering from: loneliness, spiritual exhaustion, moral decay. What this conversation revealed is that Europe isn't dying from poverty, it's dying from meaninglessness. And maybe that's why so many young people are starting to look elsewhere, to find something real, something grounded, something that tells them who they are beyond a paycheck or a screen. The truth is, when a society loses its moral center, it doesn't matter how rich or modern it becomes. It starts to crumble from within. And that's what this debate was really about. Not religion versus reason, but purpose versus emptiness. And which one will define the future of the West? You know, when you really look at it, one of the most powerful things about Islam isn't just its theology or rituals. It's the social structure it builds around human beings. It's the family. It's the respect for elders. It's the compassion for those who have less. These aren't just ideas written in some old text. They're lived values that hold entire communities together. In the West, we've become so obsessed with independence that we've forgotten interdependence. We tell our young people to move out early, chase their careers, build their own lives, and somewhere along the line, we lost the sense of belonging, of duty, of care. In many Muslim families, you'll see 3 generations living under one roof, grandparents teaching wisdom, parents guiding discipline, children growing up with a sense of roots and respect. That's not backward, that's strength. And the compassion for the poor, it's not charity for show, it's obligation, it's justice. Zakat, community giving, neighborly responsibility, these things create a moral economy, a sense that everyone matters. Meanwhile, in the West, we have billionaires hoarding wealth while millions can't afford rent or health care. That's not progress. That's imbalance. What this conversation exposed was that Islam's social fabric, the way it weaves morality into everyday life, has something the modern world desperately needs: balance, empathy, humility. These values are not outdated. They are timeless. And as Europe and America wrestle with broken families, rising loneliness, and widening inequality, maybe it's time to stop mocking these principles and start learning from them. Because a society that forgets how to care for its people, that stops honoring the wisdom of its elders or the pain of its poor, is a society standing on the edge of collapse, no matter how advanced it looks from the outside. Let's talk about something people don't usually connect: economics and morality. Because here's the truth. We've built a system in the modern West that celebrates profit over people, greed over justice, and we call it progress. But if you look closely at the principles of Islam, you find something incredibly powerful: a moral framework that ties wealth directly to responsibility. It's not anti-wealth, it's anti-exploitation. It says you can earn, but you must also give. You can succeed, but not by stepping on others. Concepts like zakat, the obligation to give a portion of one's income to those in need, or the prohibition of riba, interest-based exploitation, are not just religious rules. They're safeguards against the same economic inequality that's tearing modern societies apart. In a world where billionaires get richer while workers can't afford housing, these principles hit like truth. Islam demands balance, not the fake kind you see in corporate slogans, but real ethical accountability. It reminds people that wealth without justice is corruption, and power without compassion is tyranny. Imagine if our global markets operated with that kind of conscience. No price gouging, no predatory lending, no hoarding while others starve. It's radical only because we've strayed so far from fairness. What King Charles and I think so many people were hinting at in that conversation was this: the Islamic system, when understood beyond stereotypes, holds a mirror to Western capitalism and asks a hard question: what good is your progress if it leaves your people morally bankrupt? And that's not just a critique, that's a wake-up call. Because the future isn't just about technology or trade. It's about whether we have the courage to build an economy with a soul. You turn on the television, you open a newspaper, and what do you see when Islam is mentioned? It's war, it's conflict, it's extremism, always the same tired, shallow narrative. The media, for decades, has failed to do one simple thing: to understand. They've taken one of the most spiritually rich, intellectually profound traditions in human history and reduced it to a headline designed to scare you. And it's not just ignorance, it's convenience. Fear sells. Division keeps people distracted. Instead of talking about how Islam inspired centuries of science, art, philosophy, and justice, they focus on the fringe. They turn faith into politics, devotion into ideology, and believers into stereotypes. That's not journalism, that's propaganda with better lighting. What's tragic is that millions of good, peaceful, intelligent Muslims wake up every day, contribute to society, love their families, serve their communities, and yet they're invisible in the public story. The conversation about Islam has been hijacked by people who never cared to listen, who never sat with a scholar, who never opened the Quran with curiosity instead of suspicion. And the result is that we've built walls of fear instead of bridges of understanding. The media had a chance, a responsibility, to show that Islam is not a threat to civilization, but a part of it, a civilization that once taught the world how to think, how to heal, how to live with purpose. But instead, they chose the easy road: conflict over context, sound bites over truth, and that's what this debate tried to challenge. Because until we start seeing Islam not as a headline, but as a human story, one of intellect, spirituality, and balance, we're going to keep living in a world where misunderstanding is policy and fear is profit. Let me tell you something, folks, and I want you to really think about this. Across the Western world today, we are seeing something truly remarkable. A younger generation, kids who grew up surrounded by technology, consumerism, and a culture that tells them happiness comes from the next purchase, the next click, the next distraction, or saying, wait a second, this isn't enough. They're tired of being told that meaning is just about money, status, or fame. They are looking for something deeper, something real, something that gives them discipline and direction. And you know what? A surprising number of these young people are turning towards spirituality. And yes, in particular toward Islam, because they see in it a structure, a community, a sense of peace that they feel is missing in their own societies. They're not drawn by politics or dogma. They're drawn by purpose, by the idea of living a life that is connected to something higher than themselves, that values humility, family, justice, and self-restraint in a world that constantly tells them, do whatever you want, whenever you want. They're rejecting the chaos of a culture that sold them anxiety and calling it freedom. And I say we should listen to that. Because when young people, no matter where they come from, start searching for meaning, for values, for community, it tells us that something is deeply broken in the world we've built. It's not about East versus West or religion versus secularism. It's about a generation that's hungry for truth, for belonging, for a moral compass in a time when everything feels uncertain, when people are lonely, disconnected, and searching for peace. And you can't tweet that peace, you can't buy it, you can only live it. When we talk about King Charles, we're not just talking about a man born into privilege, we're talking about someone who, for decades, has shown a genuine respect, even admiration, for the beauty and depth of Islamic civilization, and that, frankly, is something we don't hear enough about. He's looked at Islamic art, at its geometry, its symmetry, its incredible craftsmanship, and he said, there is wisdom here, there is balance here, there is an understanding of harmony between the material and the spiritual. And he's right, because for centuries, while Europe was still finding its footing, the Muslim world was leading in mathematics, in astronomy, in medicine, in architecture, in philosophy. And those contributions didn't just disappear, they helped build the foundation of what we now call modern science and rational thought. King Charles, to his credit, has been one of the few Western leaders willing to say that openly, that we owe a debt to Islamic civilization for preserving and expanding the knowledge that shaped the Renaissance itself. He's talked about how the calligraphy, the domes, the gardens, the mosques reflect a worldview that connects human creativity to divine order, not as something in conflict, but as something unified, something whole. And that, folks, is a perspective rooted not in politics, but in cultural humility, in the understanding that civilizations rise not by isolation, but by exchange, by respect, by learning from one another. In a time when too many people want to divide, to fear, to misunderstand, here's a man looking at the Islamic world and saying, there's wisdom here, there's beauty here, and we can learn from it. And I think that, my friends, is the kind of mindset the modern world could use a lot more of. There was this moment, and it wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't planned, it wasn't some political performance, it was real. A moment of silence between two people who had been talking for hours about the state of Europe, about the loss of values, about the emptiness that comes when a society forgets what it stands for, and suddenly they both stopped. They both looked at each other, and you could see it in their eyes. This realization that maybe, just maybe, the key to moral renewal in Europe, the key to recovering that sense of balance, of meaning, could come from understanding Islam, not as a threat, not as the other, but as a source of wisdom, discipline, and spiritual clarity that the modern world has forgotten. And I'm telling you, folks, this wasn't about converting anyone or romanticizing anything. It was about respect, about recognition that this ancient tradition has held on to certain truths that the West, in its race for progress, has let slip through its fingers. They were talking about how Europe, for all its wealth, for all its freedoms, is struggling with cynicism, loneliness, moral confusion. People don't know what's right or wrong anymore because everything's become relative, everything's negotiable. And here you have a faith that still believes in moral absolutes, in compassion, in justice, in self-restraint, and in the idea that your life has a purpose beyond consumption and self-interest. And when those two speakers paused, when their words fell away, the air in the room changed. You could feel the weight of it, the honesty, the pain, and the hope the hope that maybe understanding Islam, not as ideology, but as civilization, as moral compass, could help Europe remember who it is, what it values, what it owes to the deeper traditions of humanity. It was a human moment, not political, not academic. Just two people realizing that renewal might not come from another policy, another slogan, but from humility, from looking beyond one's own culture and saying, maybe the answers are not all ours. And I tell you, folks, in a time when everyone's shouting, that kind of quiet realization, that's powerful, that's rare, and that's the beginning of wisdom. There was this moment, and it wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't planned, it wasn't some political performance, it was real. A moment of silence between two people who had been talking for hours about the state of Europe, about the loss of values, about the emptiness that comes when a society forgets what it stands for, and suddenly they both stopped, they both looked at each other, and you could see it in their eyes, this realization that maybe, just maybe, the key to moral renewal in Europe, the key to recovering that sense of balance, of meaning, could come from understanding Islam, not as a threat, not as the other, but as a source of wisdom, discipline, and spiritual clarity that the modern world has forgotten. And I'm telling you, folks, this wasn't about converting anyone or romanticizing anything. It was about respect, about recognition that this ancient tradition has held onto certain truths that the West, in its race for progress, has let slip through its fingers. They were talking about how Europe, for all its wealth, for all its freedoms, is struggling with cynicism, loneliness, moral confusion. People don't know what's right or wrong anymore because everything's become relative, everything's negotiable. And here you have a faith that still believes in moral absolutes, in compassion, in justice, in self-restraint, and in the idea that your life has a purpose beyond consumption and self-interest. And when those two speakers paused, when their words fell away, the air in the room changed. You could feel the weight of it, the honesty, the pain, and the hope that maybe understanding Islam not as ideology, but as civilization, as moral compass, could help Europe remember who it is, what it values, what it owes to the deeper traditions of humanity. It was a human moment, not political, not academic, just two people realizing that renewal might not come from another policy, another slogan, but from humility, from looking beyond one's own culture and saying, maybe the answers are not all ours. And I tell you, folks, in a time when everyone's shouting that kind of quiet realization, that's powerful, that's rare, and that's the beginning of wisdom.